The stars stretched into long shimmering threads as the ship tore through FTL, but Wyatt felt none of the awe he used to feel when he was younger. Back then, FTL meant dreams, escape, possibility, a future. Now it felt like a narrow tunnel closing in around him. Commander Redford stood at the front of the cabin, hands clasped behind his back, his expression carved from stone. Wyatt listened in silence as the older man explained the truth behind the attack they had narrowly escaped. The Principality was collapsing into political chaos. Noble houses were dividing, loyalties were breaking, and Duke Draymor's betrayal had pushed everything beyond the point of repair. Wyatt felt the tremor in his fingertips as the commander spoke. He wasn't trained for politics, he wasn't raised for the tangled feuds of nobility. He was a commoner, a refugee hauler pilot, someone who flew scrap, not star destroyers. Yet the more Redford spoke, the more Wyatt realized he had crossed a line by saving the commander's life, one that could never be uncrossed. The universe had just become a lot bigger and far more dangerous. When the ship dropped out of FTL, the blur of light reformed into a spread of stars and a formation of ships waiting for them. 21 vessels floated in a tight defensive net, their shield halos glowing faintly in the dark vacuum. They were small but heavily armed, the kind of ships loyalists used when they needed to defend something important. At their center was a cruiser so massive and elegant that Wyatt forgot to breathe for a moment. Its black-blue hull glistened with a metallic sheen, weapon ports dotted its surface like eyes, and golden royal engravings ran along its ridges like veins of light. Wyatt whispered to himself in awe. This wasn't just a vessel, this was a symbol of authority, of lineage, of power. This was the prince's flagship. As Wyatt guided his battered garbage hauler toward the hangar, he felt its insignificance more painfully than ever. The hangar swallowed both ships with ease, and the moment Commander Redford stepped out of the royal yacht, every crew member turned and saluted him. Wyatt stepped out unnoticed and unacknowledged, a man out of place among the finest uniforms and cleanest metal he'd ever seen. He tried not to shrink under the size of it all as he followed Redford into the ship. The corridors were a world apart from the rusted transport ships Wyatt had spent his life in. Everything gleamed, polished floors, floating screens, gold-trimmed pillars reinforced with military-grade alloys. Officers in crisp uniforms moved with precise steps, augmented eyes glowing gently as they read data he couldn't even imagine. Wyatt tried not to stare too long, he didn't want to seem like a tourist or, worse, a beggar. He reminded himself to walk straight, keep his chin up, and mask the resentment that simmered deep in his chest. Nobles always lived like this, untouchable and unaware of the struggles of common folk. Wyatt envied them, hated them a little, but also respected the structure they enforced. Without them, the Principality would have collapsed years ago. So he hid the envy, hid the bitterness, and followed Redford in quiet obedience. He kept reminding himself, no matter how extraordinary the ship looked, it wasn't his place to admire or criticize. He was here because of an accident, or fate. The bridge doors slid open, revealing the heart of the flagship. It was like a cathedral of light and steel, filled with officers working their stations in silence. At the center stood a figure dressed in deep blue with golden trimming, a cape bearing the crest of the royal family draped neatly over his shoulder. When he turned, Wyatt froze. The prince was far more striking in person than any broadcast or propaganda image could hope to capture. His blonde hair framed a face sculpted with noble precision, and his violet eyes glowed with the unmistakable shine of high-tier cybernetics, technology commoners like Wyatt could never afford. Yet despite the enhancements, there was a raw humanity in those eyes, a warmth hidden beneath the stoic exterior. Redford approached and delivered his report efficiently, describing the attack, Wyatt's intervention, and their escape. When the commander finished, the prince turned his full attention toward Wyatt. Wyatt's heart hammered against his ribs. Never in his life had he imagined the prince speaking to him directly. The prince stepped closer, his voice firm yet surprisingly gentle as he thanked Wyatt for his actions. Wyatt managed a stiff bow and a shaky response, insisting that he had only done what was expected of him as a servant of the Principality. The prince's lips curved into a faint smirk as he lifted his chin. He spoke of duty, honor, and reward, not the kind of empty praise nobles threw around for political gain, but sincere recognition. Then the prince delivered a shock that nearly knocked Wyatt off his feet. As of this moment, he said, you are officially promoted to the rank of lieutenant. Gasps spread across the bridge. Even Redford blinked in surprise. Wyatt stumbled over his words, trying to protest, to remind the prince that he was a commoner, that laws forbade such a leap in rank. But the prince silenced him with a raised hand and explained that times had changed. Desperate days demanded bold decisions. Gratitude could not be shackled by old traditions. Wyatt felt light-headed, caught between honor and terror. Redford guided him out once the prince dismissed them, and the moment they left the bridge's glow, reality hit Wyatt like a meteor. A lieutenant. Him. The thought echoed in his skull. Redford noticed the panic in his eyes and stopped him before he spiraled too far. There would be war, of that much Redford was certain. Noble houses would pick sides, and the principality would become a battleground. The prince, however, was determined to prevent a complete collapse. He wasn't fighting for glory or ego, Redford insisted. He was fighting for order, for the legacy that had kept the stars under one banner for generations. Wyatt slowly absorbed the words. His breath steadied. Redford placed a firm hand on his shoulder and reminded him that he had already chosen a side the moment he acted to save the commander's life. Even if he had not intervened, the conflict would have found him eventually. At least now he stood with honor. Wyatt couldn't disagree. They reached the officer quarters, and Redford opened a door to Wyatt's new cabin. For a noble it would have been nothing special, but to Wyatt, it was a palace. A real bed. A personal desk. Soft lighting. Clean walls. A private washroom and shower, luxuries he had never had in his entire career. Wyatt stepped inside as if afraid the room might vanish if he moved too suddenly. Redford told him to rest and prepare for the days ahead before leaving. Wyatt collapsed onto the bed, overwhelmed. His entire life had shifted in the span of a few hours. He stared at the ceiling, thinking about home, about the academy, about all the doubts he had swallowed over the years. Now he was on the flagship of the most powerful man in the principality. A prince had spoken to him. A prince had promoted him. And the shadow of war loomed over everything. As exhaustion overtook him, Wyatt drifted into sleep, unsure whether he was stepping into destiny or disaster. Outside, in the silent stretches of space beyond the flagship's shields, a singular silhouette drifted far out of sensor range. A ship with no lights. No broadcast signals. No insignia. Its hull was black enough to swallow starlight. It moved slowly, like a predator circling prey. The flagship's loyalist escort ships continued their quiet vigil, unaware of the danger creeping into their shadow. The black ship's engines pulsed once, faint and hollow, as if testing the air. Then it turned slightly, angling itself toward the cruiser where Wyatt slept. A cold whisper echoed inside its command chamber as unknown figures watched their target with emotionless eyes. Phase 1 complete, a distorted voice murmured. The prince has taken the bait. Prepare the next move. Back on the flagship, Wyatt sat on the edge of his bed, shaking hands pressed together. He had been dragged from the world he knew, commoner life, routine flight paths, quiet insignificance, and thrown into the heart of a political storm. A conflict that spanned families, legacies, and centuries of buried tension. He didn't know what the future held. He didn't know whether he would live long enough to see peace again. But for the first time in his life, he had been seen, recognized, trusted, perhaps even valued. As he inhaled slowly, he accepted a truth he had never imagined. Whatever fate the principality marched toward, he would be part of it. And in the quiet of that moment, with war creeping closer and shadows tightening their grip, the story of Lieutenant Wyatt Staples truly began.